Hello, everybody. I'm Stephanie Curtis. I'm the Director of Programming for Minnesota Public Radio News. I'm so excited to have you all here. Thank you for getting through that line. They've got quite a system, and I'm happy that you all made it in. Thank you for anyone who's already been to Talking Volumes. Welcome back. And to those of you who haven't been here before, it's going to be a great night. We wouldn't be able to have programs like Talking Volumes without members of Minnesota Public Radio, the Star Tribune subscribers out there, and then our season sponsors, Bremer Bank and Becker Furniture World. And Minnesota Public Radio has these really tight ties with some educational sponsors, including the College of St. Scholastica. So thanks to all of them for being our supporters and to all of you who are members or subscribers. Speaking of the Star Tribune, Sue Campbell is here. Sue, come on out and tell us what's happening at the Star Tribune. Hello.
Hello, Steph.
You described yourself as editing the fun side of the paper.
I get to edit all the fun sections, including the books coverage, which we still have 2 pages up every Sunday, so I hope you guys are all following it. So I'm here to remind you that next week in the paper, we have a great feature on Louise Erdrich. Her new book is coming out, and we have a fabulous conversation with her. And then we also have Lori Herzl's bookmark column, and she had invited readers to talk about their book clubs, pro or con, joining a book club. And it's amazing how
Are there cons?
There are cons, and the cons will be in the paper. The pros will be first, and the cons will be next. So now you have to read 2 weeks in a row.
I'm there. Thanks, Sue. Thank you so much. All right, let's get the evening started. Kerri Miller, you can hear her every Friday on NPR News at 11, and she's your host for tonight. Kerri, come on out.
Hi, everyone. Wow. I love seeing book-loving people way up in the third balcony. So have a seat up there. The show's about to start. Welcome, everyone, to Talking Volumes. These are always bittersweet evenings for me because I come to a night like this with a real sense of accomplishment. We've had some absolutely wonderful conversations with authors, but I also know that it's going to be another year, almost a year, before I see many of you. So thank you so much for supporting Talking Volumes. Please, a round of applause for those of you who have come for the first time tonight and those of you that have come for the whole season. Thank you. We're starting a little late, so I'm just going to get right to the show. I'm going to say that this night has been a long, long time in coming. I am thrilled at long last to welcome William Kent Krueger to the stage of the Fitzgerald Theater for Talking Volumes. We've never done this before.
I got to tell you, I am just so thrilled to be here this evening. I'm so honored to be a part of this legendary program. Thank you, Kerri.
No, thank you, Ken. It's great to have you here. What you've done with Lightning Strike as a prequel is an interesting endeavor for an author who has spent, is it 22, 23 years? How long writing this character of Cork O'Connor?
Well, I actually began writing the character in 1992.
Okay.
I didn't publish that particular piece until 1998. So from 1998, and so 23 years now, Cork and I have been together as published. Thank you, Cork.
So this is, as said, is an interesting endeavor to write a character and develop a character that long, and then go back into that life, that childhood, and reveal lay a foundation of the man and the character that Cork is going to be. So I'm interested in how you thought about that as you began the prequel.
You make it sound a lot harder than it actually was. You know, I've lived with Cork for so long that who he is as a man, I know quite well, although I'm always discovering new and interesting sides to Cork that I wasn't aware of. But it was easy for me to imagine Cork as a kid. And I have to be perfectly frank with you. The way I imagined Cork as a kid was kind of the way I was as a kid.
Okay.
There's a lot about Cork at 12 years of age that was just like I was at 12 years of age. Cork was a Boy Scout. I was a Boy Scout. Cork at that age has he has, I think, 3 paper routes. I had 3 paper routes. So yeah, it was easy for me to tap into what I remember as an adolescent male and give Cork a lot of that background.
The other thing that you were doing all along as you developed Cork as a character, I would think, is imbuing him with certain qualities, characteristics that you were going to live with through the long haul, right? I mean, this is not, you knew, this is not a character, at some point you knew, this is a character that you and we, the readers, were going to live with for a while. So I'm curious about how you thought about the characteristics that you would imbue his personality with, and how they would evolve over the long term.
Oh, you credit me with a great deal more vision than I actually had. When I was writing the first book in the Cork O'Connor series, Iron Lake, I just wanted to write a manuscript that was good enough somebody might actually want to publish it. And I wasn't thinking much beyond that. But as I was creating the Cork O'Connor character, I was making choices about who he was.
Right.
Not necessarily who he was going to be through 18 novels, but who he was for that particular work. And so I made him a lot like me. So Cork's a family man. I'm a family man. I gave Cork a lot of the moral compass that I have. Cork is a man who believes that you make commitments in this life, and come hell or high water, you stand by those commitments, and I believe that. Cork believes that one of the reasons we're put on this earth is to seek justice for others. I believe that. Cork believes that in this life, family is probably the most significant relationship any of us are ever going to know, and that's what I believe as well. So creating Cork out of a lot of my own perceptions was not a difficult thing to do. But then I made a decision about Cork that was problematic. I decided to make him a man of mixed heritage, and that presented enormous challenges for me. Do you want me to go on? So the first decision I made in the Cork O'Connor series was to set it up north. I'm not native to Minnesota. I didn't move here until I was about 30 years old, so my wife could go to the U of M law school. And before that, I was a gypsy kid. I lived all over the place. I never had anywhere that I really thought of or called home. But I swear to God, the minute I set foot in Minnesota, I knew I'd found home. I fell in love with this place. So I always knew when I got serious about my writing, whatever I did was going to be kind of a homage to Minnesota, to this adopted home. And shortly after we moved here, we began doing what everybody in the Twin Cities does in the summer. We started vacationing up north. So we began spending part of every summer at a YMCA camp north of Ely, a place called Camp de Nord. How many of you? Yeah, Camp de Nord. Which is, for those of you who don't know it, it's literally across the road from the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness. And when I discovered that remarkable territory, I knew this is what I want to write about. When I took a really good look at northern Minnesota, I realized you can't write a story set in northern Minnesota without including the Ojibwe, the Anishinaabe, as an element of the work, because their influence up there is ubiquitous. It's everywhere, and it's powerful. So I decided I was going to include the Ojibwe culture as one of the things that I would write about. Now, fiction writing 101. When you're a fiction writer, what are you looking for? You're looking for conflict, because it's conflict that drives great stories. And when I looked up north, that's what I saw was conflict. Conflict in the weather, conflict in that rugged landscape, conflict in the cultures that are trying to live up there together, and often not doing a particularly good job of it. But when I thought about the issue of conflict more specifically, I thought, what if I created a character who, in who he was, could mirror the conflict of those two cultures, white and Ojibwe? And that's when I decided to make Cork part Ojibwe. What did I know about the culture of the Anishinaabe? Nothing, which is what most white people know, right? But I was a cultural anthropology major in college, and so the idea of learning about this culture, not my own, was exciting. And so I began in the way every good academic begins. I began by reading. I read everything I could get my hands on. In the course of my research, I began to meet and form relationships with folks inside the Ojibwe community, relationships that have become important friendships to me over the years. And so Cork naturally evolved out of all of that.
So a lot of questions come to mind about what you've just said. Let me go back to what you said about imbuing Cork with the moral compass that you identify with. I feel like one of the tensions, one of the conflicts in his character, and we see it really clearly in what's happening with his father in this novel and what he's witnessing, is this idea of what it means to hold your integrity as a high value and what happens when people don't perceive you that way or question your integrity. I mean, this is happening to Liam, Cork's father in the novel. And Cork is seeing what, and will experience this, seeing what that means to a person to have your integrity questioned. That was not, I feel like we are seeing the making of that experience in Cork that's going to become very important for his life. Will you reflect on that for a minute?
Sure. Enlightening, for those of you who don't know anything about my Cork O'Connor series, Cork is actually 1/4 Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and 3/4 Irish. So he doesn't, I never describe Cork because my own belief is readers need to be able to see Cork in a way that works for them. But I see him resembling more his Irish heritage than his Ojibwe heritage. Mm-hmm. And so he is a kid who is growing up in his own perception one way. And then in lightning strike, he begins to become aware that the rest of Tamarack County, Aurora, Minnesota, think of him in another way. Mm-hmm. And what they see in him is the Ojibwe blood. And so he becomes aware that a lot of the unfortunate names that we put on Native Americans are being applied to him as well. And he becomes aware that it's not just him, but it's his father, right, and it's his mother, and it's his grandmother. And so suddenly he is thrust into this world that now is beginning to make less and less sense to him. And he's having to figure out, okay, what's this world really like? And who am I in this world? Which is part of this story. But isn't that part of everybody's story, right?
He's seeing as a child what it means to have a beloved parent, his father, his motives, again, his integrity, his own moral compass question. That is a formative experience for a child, isn't it?
Yes.
Say more.
So, the summer I was 13 years old, very formative summer for me. My father got fired from his job. He had started out his career as an high school English teacher in Wyoming, but once he'd had 3 children, he realized they weren't paying teachers enough, English teachers at any rate, enough to raise a family. So he left teaching and he joined the oil business, which is why I moved around a whole lot as a kid. When I was 13 years old, my father was head of the what would be human relations division of a large chemical plant in Ohio. And I knew that it was putting a great deal of pressure on his belief system, because he would be on one side of a negotiating table for the company, dealing with all of the workers, the people who represented the workers, and his heart was with the workers. He hired the first black engineer that had ever been hired in that chemical company, and he took an enormous amount of flack for it. And finally, they fired him because it was clear that his belief system was not theirs. Mm-hmm. And I remember feeling at first, oh, Dad, that's so horrible. You got fired. And then as I began to understand it more, it was like, oh, Dad, I'm really glad that happened. You stood up for what you believed in. And then he went back to teaching, which is what he really loved. So there's a moral there for you.
Do you remember your dad explaining to you what had happened? The night that he was fired, maybe overhearing your parents talking about it, or what he said to you?
Yeah, I don't remember him explaining it that night, but I remember in the course of everything, it became clear to us that he was in an environment that was poisonous to him. Mm-hmm. And the separation was a very good thing. And maybe because, he was a family man and he felt like he had to support the family, he stayed with this job much longer than was probably healthy for him. Mm-hmm. And maybe it was his employer who said, it's time for you to go. They saw it before he did, or before he was willing to do that. But in the end, it was a good thing. And he explained to us, essentially, the difference, the importance of his values to him, and how they collided with the values of that particular world, and how his decision then to go back to teaching, I got to tell you, he became a different man. And we embarked on one of the greatest adventures of our lives as we began moving kind of from place to place with him as a teacher, following his heart, which, was a huge model for me. Follow your heart.
Have you ever had an era in your life where you felt like you were at odds with your moral compass, where you were not living up to letting integrity guide your decision-making, or just somehow you'd veered away from that moral compass that you believe is at the heart of your identity?
Yeah, once. Oh, you want me to talk about it?
Oh, yeah. What do you think we're doing here, Ken?
So, Vietnam. We'll go back in history a bit. I went to Stanford University. I got kicked out of Stanford University. For all the right reasons.
For what?
When I went to Stanford, I matriculated at Stanford in 1969. This was at the height of the Vietnam War. And Stanford had a relationship with an organization called the Stanford Research Institute at that point in time, whose primary source of income then was research into military weaponry. There were a lot of us at Stanford who felt that that was a really inappropriate relationship for an institution like Stanford to maintain, particularly at that point in time. So we petitioned the board of directors, the trustees, to sever the relationship. We petitioned the administration. We marched. We sat in. Of course, nobody paid any attention to us because there were huge sums of money involved. And finally, in frustration, a group of us marched into the administration building one day and occupied it. The president, a guy named Richard Lyman, was pretty reasonable. He said, I'm not going to give you any problem. He vacated the building, and we took it over. That night, about 8 o'clock, we had a band come in, and we held a dance where typically we would have been registering. And at midnight, the band packed up and took off, and those of us who were going to occupy the administration building rolled out our sleeping bags and went to sleep. Huge tactical error. Because at 1 o'clock, the Palo Alto riot squad swept through and arrested us all. I was on a full scholarship. It evaporated,
really?
yeah, and
Oh
so I
my gosh.
had to leave school. So Now, that was not when I moved away from my
That aligned with your moral compass,
Yeah, but
right?
what happened the next year was the school that I went into after that didn't accept all of my credits from Stanford because, as the admissions officer explained to me, we have to be very careful about the institutions we accept credits from. So suddenly, I lost my student status, my student deferment, and I was drafted.
Oh, wow.
So I was really in a dilemma. Well, I didn't believe in the war. My brother was a conscientious objector. I wasn't sure what I should do, but I went to my pre-induction physical. I completed all of that. And that's the point where, I thought, you go into the Army, that's what you do, or you go to jail. And I didn't want to do either of those things, but I really didn't want to go to jail. And I didn't believe in what we were doing in Vietnam enough to really want to participate in that. So I was about to crack. Oh, there are angels in this world, people, and here's a case in point. I went to my draft board. I had some issue that I needed to resolve with them. And I'd been down there many times, and when I walked into the draft board that day, there was an elderly woman there who had never been there before. And I explained to her what I needed or whatever, and she looked up at me and she said, "You don't want to go to war, do you, honey?" And I said, "No, ma'am, I don't." And she explained what I needed, and nobody had ever done this. She explained exactly what I needed to do to reinstate my student deferment in very clear steps. I went back to the draft board several times after that for various reasons, and I never saw her again.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I mean, magic
Yeah.
in some ways, right?
Yeah.
So that year gave you a glimpse of what it might be like to have to, because of all these events that had happened, do something that was so antithetical to.
Certainly contemplated. Yeah.
What'd you take away from that?
That there are angels in this world. I think the circumstances sometimes. I think the arc of the universe bends toward justice. Martin Luther King.
Yeah.
I think he was quoting someone else. And that if you hold to your guns, if you stand by what you believe, eventually you are vindicated. People will understand. I mean, even if in the moment that doesn't happen, and I mean, look at so many examples in history where people didn't understand what was occurring, and later on it's like, oh, well, we get it now. Mm-hmm. We understand what you were saying. So, yeah. Did I answer the question?
Yeah. Yes, you did.
I feel like I've been rambling.
Yeah, not at all. This is also a novel, as we were discussing downstairs in the green room, of fathers and sons. And I value how genuine this relationship feels. It is not saccharine. There's times when Liam, Cork's father, who's a sheriff and under a lot of pressure, is terse with his son or doesn't explain in the moment that he probably should. And Cork has an opportunity to see what it means to, what the real world brings, right, into your home and into your loved one's circle, which again is a really foundational, kind of transformational experience. Now that you've said that so much of this is autobiographical, I'm curious about how you look back on the relationship with your dad and how much of that has ended up in the tenor of this relationship of these two.
I'm sure a great deal of it is there. In the relationship, I think, and maybe this is true from women and their mothers, but certainly in the relationship that men, when they're young, have with their fathers, as we move into our adolescence and begin to have a sense that I'm somebody else, maybe, than you have wanted me to be. And I need to know who that is. Conflict arises. You begin to question values. You begin to question actions. You begin to question motives. And we're certainly seeing that in Cork's relationship with his father. And I certainly went through that as well. But I think I questioned my father less simply because our circumstances were such, when I was going through my adolescence, that we, as a family, had to pull together. When father lost his job, then when Vietnam rolled around, my father took a stand against the war and was essentially fired from his teaching job.
Wow.
And so we had to move as a result of that. So more than conflict with my father, I think I was just learning lesson after lesson after lesson. It was only later when I had children of my own, and he was trying to tell me how to raise them, that problems arose.
But you saw your father, you really began to understand what loss looks like for standing up for what you believe. I don't think being put to the test like that happens all that often in a family. I mean, that's a remarkable thing that your father did and showed, his children what that means to do, what that means.
Yeah, he was a pretty remarkable guy. What can I say? I loved him dearly. Well, as long as we're on my father, let me tell you another father story.
Good.
So my father was a teacher in the school that, the last year he taught in this school was when he left because of his stand in Vietnam, which conflicted with the school board and much of the community. But on graduation, at the graduation ceremony, the senior class stood up and they sang to him, "To Sir with Love."
Oh.
That was my father.
And so that brings me back to this relationship between Cork and Liam. It feels, as I said, genuine and fraught with all the winds that are buffeting Liam and his career and his relationships and his standing in the community. Now I understand a little more about where you've drawn this from.
Do you know, and the story, for those of you who haven't had a chance to read Lightning Strike, but you should.
And you will.
It's not just from Cork's point of view, it's also from his father's point of view.
Right.
So as Cork is struggling to understand his father, the reasons for his father's decisions, why his father doesn't quite get the perspective that Cork, because he has Ojibwe blood in him, shares really with his mother's side, the Ojibwe side of him. Liam is also trying to understand his son. And Liam is a little less like my father in that Liam has difficulty telling his son that he loves him. Mm-hmm. This is not a man who really embraces his son, hugs his son, which my father did all the time. And maybe it was probably more like fathers of that generation who weren't demonstrative in expressing their love for their sons or maybe their children or maybe even their wives. But he is a man who really deeply loves and cares about his family. And that comes through in the Liam sections. Although he doesn't always say that, it comes through clear. It comes through that he loves his family. It comes through that they love him and that this is difficult for them all to get through.
Mm-hmm. I mean, this family and each of the characters in this mother, father, son, they're all being tested in a way. I mean, this passage that they are working their way through, in a different ending, they might have looked back and said, that was the moment we understood what we were made of, what this family, what held us together, who we are, what the identity of this family is.
Let me explain something to those of you in the audience who haven't read Lightning Strike. The story revolves around the death of an Ojibwe elder, a respected Ojibwe elder, and the manner of his death is in question, whether it was a suicide or not. The Ojibwe community sees it in one way, the white community perceives it in another. And Liam, as sheriff, is trying to understand the truth, and he's getting pressure from both sides in terms of how he handles the investigation. And that's really the source of in this particular story, the source of the conflict.
And so each part of the family is feeling different kinds of pressure and having their own moral compasses, I would say, tested in this moment.
Yeah, this is a story not just about conflict within the community, it's also conflict within the family.
For sure.
As a result of the mixture of the heritage and the marriage.
Right. We chatted a little bit about this downstairs. As with the father and son relationship, the husband and wife relationship is also fraught and deep and loving and being tested in a way that a long marriage, you look back and say, that was the moment we figured out what we were made of. Will you describe a little bit about why this husband and wife are also in conflict with the communities, but also in some conflict with themselves?
Cork's mother is half Ojibwe. Cork's grandmother, Grandma Dilsey, is a true-blood Iron Lake Ojibwe. And so Colleen, Cork's mother, is in the difficult position of wanting to support her husband and yet believing that he's not seeing the Ojibwe perspective in this. And so she is really torn. Again, when you're writing a novel, a piece of fiction, you're looking for conflict, and boy, is there a lot of it in this story. And I think that's, although it's this particular issue right now that causes conflict, I think if you're involved in any marriage, any good relationship that's long-term, there's gonna be conflict. You're going to see things in very different ways. And so a lot of what, in my experience, marriage is all about is coming to that place that you both can accept. And Cork's father and Cork's mother are having real trouble getting there.
Tell me how confident you felt in working your way through those scenes where Liam and Colleen, the husband and wife, Cork's parents, are speaking back and forth to one another, and they're kind of working this out in this communication.
You know, when you're deep into the imagining of a story, I mean, when you really sink yourself into it, those kinds of scenes come fairly naturally. I don't have a great deal of difficulty creating the scene, and typically don't have to go back and do a great deal of revision.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay. So this, as it flowed, as this dialogue, which is tense, but also, again, loving, this came easily to you.
Well, that's my recollection anyway.
Yeah. Would you read a first excerpt?
Sure.
And maybe you'll set this up a little bit, Kent. I've asked if he will read a scene from Colleen and Liam talking about this, but describe a little bit about where we're at.
The death has occurred, and Liam has been investigating it for some time, and the Ojibwe community feels he's asking all the wrong questions and asking all the wrong people, And the white community just wants him to wrap it up because everybody knows what really happened in the white community. And Liam and Colleen, his wife, talk about this a great deal. But the other thing that's going on in their relationship is Liam having to deal with the fact that Cork is growing and changing and becoming his own man. And he's having some trouble with that as well. And that's kind of what's going on in this scene. What's wrong, Colleen asked. You haven't said 2 words since supper. He's growing up fast. Cork? Used to be when I suggested we toss the football. He was all over that. Now, it's one night, Liam. My father never tossed a football with me. Tell you what, when we finish the dishes, we'll go into the backyard and I'll throw you the football. He smiled as he knew she intended, but shook his head. Work to do. Cop work? I'm going to talk to Mary Margaret. Alone? That's what I'm shooting for. Will Duncan allow that? If I'm lucky, he won't be there. When I talked to him in the guest cottage, it looked to me as if that might be where he's spending his nights now. If you ask me, after what he did to Mary Margaret, he should be spending his nights in jail. I'm doing my best to put him there. Does that mean you think Oscar Many-Deeds is in the clear? In the clear? You've been watching too many cop shows. But no, that's not what it means. Just following up on all the possibilities. She paused in her work, her hands deep in the soapy water, and looked at her husband steadily. Liam, you're not from here. You're a wonderful cop, and that's why you're our sheriff. But there are forces at work in this place that you can't possibly understand, emotions that run deep and go back to forever. You're walking a thin line, and she took a wet hand from the sink and put it to his cheek. And what? There's a fire here that's raged for generations, and you're walking right into the middle of it. I'm wondering what will be left of you when you come out on the other side. Her wet hand was still held against his face, and drips of water crawled down his cheek with the same feel as tears.
Adukan, have no fear. Coco missing our vows to stay near. The giant is waking and the earth is quaking. Adukan, Adukan, have no fear. The mountains are rumbling and the towers are crumbling everywhere. The fires and the floods have begun. The system is desperate and obscene. So I say, shame upon you, shame. You're just a violent, racist regime. Adukan, Adukan, have no fear. Adukan, Adukan, have no fear. to come the way is in our stories. Dance them back to life and leave them where you go. And courage, resistance, and love will surely grow. Autobiographical, have no fear. Autobiographical, have no fear.
Annie Humphreys. Thank you. It's beautiful. You're listening to Talking Volumes at the Fitzgerald Theater. We're here with writer William Kent Krueger and his new novel, Lightning Strike. And I'm Kerri Miller. I want to come back to something you said, Kent, about your admiration for the Anishinaabe and I get the sense that you're constant learning about the culture. And I read something that you wrote in 2011 about the Anishinaabe and the influence on your novels. You said, if you read my stories, please don't read them as ethnography. The Anishinaabe are far more complex culturally, rich historically, and textured spiritually than I will ever be able to adequately portray them in my writing. But if I'm able to give you a sense of the admiration I feel for them, then I've succeeded. Okay, that was 2011. That was 10 years ago. You have learned more, written more about the Anishinaabe culture. What do you think you understand now that you've been able to write into your novels? Would you say the same thing today that you wrote there?
Yeah, I was pretty amazed at myself when you read that.
Why?
Because I really think that it expresses perfectly how I continue to feel. Every time I sit down to write a Cork O'Connor novel, I'm painfully aware that I'm a white guy trespassing on a culture not my own. I have no native heritage in me, not a drop of native blood at all. And so I work very hard to try to get what I do put into the books right. And I check in with my friends in the Ojibwe community to try to make sure that I do that. Whenever I finish a manuscript, I have at least one or usually two of my Ojibwe friends read the manuscript to vet it for me to make sure that I haven't said anything that's really stupid or even worse, offensive. But the issue, of cultural appropriation is an important issue to discuss these days. And what I continue to point out to audiences is that I am a white guy. My perspective is not native. If you really want a native perspective, read Louise Erdrich, read Anton or David Treuer, read any of the fine native storytellers that are publishing these days.
I wonder if when you embarked on this character, you began writing him, you said, in the early 90s, published in 98, right? So this issue of cultural appropriation was not as urgent then as it is now. Does this feel like it has gotten riskier to you over the years?
Well, this continues to be an important area to discuss. When I made the decision to include the Ojibwe as an element of my work, Tony Hillerman was huge, white guy, not a drop of native blood in Tony, and yet he was doing a pretty good job, I thought, of offering a look into another culture here in the United States, making people aware of what the culture of the Diné, the Navajo was all about. And that's what I continue to try to do. But I'm a storyteller. And if you believe you should only write about what you absolutely know, who you absolutely are, that's so limiting. As a storyteller, you look at the world and you look at all kinds of people and you observe and you make assumptions and you create from that. And so I think I think to say that a white person cannot write about a Native person is about as ridiculous as saying a Native writer can't write about a white person. It's all about, first of all, trying to get it right, get it true, and it's all about creating a good story. Mm-hmm. And if you write true and you write a good story, I think that's all people can ask of you.
I think I hear you saying, yes, it may be a little riskier in this day and age than it was when you started. I guess I want to ask you if you would do it the same way. If you were starting the series today.
If I were starting the series today, I probably wouldn't do the same series. But I am so deeply into the Cork O'Connor series that
Why wouldn't you do the same? Why?
Because of exactly this issue. It is such a significant issue that I probably wouldn't try to tackle it.
And do you think something would be lost for a decision like that?
What I know from the response that I get, both from the Native community and from white readers, very often the response is, I knew absolutely nothing about the Ojibwe, and now I know something. Mm-hmm. Now I'm intrigued. Thank you for giving me this glimpse, this perspective. What I've heard from the Native community to a person so far in terms of those who have contacted me is that they appreciate how I have portrayed the Ojibwe culture. So here's an example. I got an email not too long ago that went something like this. Dear Mr. Krueger, I am the tribal librarian for the Lance Reservation. That's on the UP of Michigan. She said, when any of our tribal members come in and they don't really know what they want to read, I recommend your books.
Wow.
Because for a white guy, you do a pretty good job.
All right. So, I mean, so what you said about if I was starting today and I was making the decision and I hesitated or I decided not to do this, I think you said that, something would be lost perhaps from that.
Do you know what I would hope? One of the things that was going on when I broke into the business, there really were not a lot of Native authors who were writing mysteries. That is changing rapidly. We have some fine Native American mystery writers out there. I'm going to recommend a book to all of you. There's a writer, a Dakota writer out of South Dakota, a guy named David Wyden.
Oh, so good.
His debut novel came out last year, was a book called Winter Counts.
It is great.
If you want a great mystery written from a Native perspective, read Winter Counts by David Wyden.
Oh, it's so good. Here's the thing about that novel. Nothing really cataclysmic happens, but he keeps this pulse beat of tension as little incidences kind of unfold here and there. It was masterful.
And
it was a debut novel.
It's really grounded in the reality of res life.
So I'm glad you recommended that. Okay, good.
Well,
you're ready for me to move on from this, I
have
think.
to be honest, David's a good friend of mine.
Ah, he is? Oh, that's good. That's good to hear. You referenced this earlier, too. You know, we're seeing Cork as a 12-year-old, 13-year-old, experience the first pernicious effects of racism. He's finding out what people say about him when he's not around. And he asks his friend George if he's ever heard people call Cork names because his mother is Native American. And You handle that scene with what I thought of as a light touch, but also with this awareness that this is kind of an earthquake in the way Cork will see his identity. Again, I'm interested in how you approach that scene and the writing of that scene.
Well, I was creating a relationship between two adolescent males that was very like a real relationship that I had.
You and a friend from that age?
Yep, me and a friend.
Right.
And he was actually a little older when we were friends, but it was easy for me to translate that into a relationship between 12, 13-year-old boys. And so it was just how friends talk. And if you remember in that scene, George says, well, yeah, people say those things about you. I thought you knew. Because Jorge.
Jorge,
He's
yes.
George, but he goes by Jorge because his mother is Hispanic. Jorge says, yeah, they say these things about me all the time. And the other friend who is Ojibwe says, yeah, I hear those things too. But this is the first time Cork has heard them about himself. And so he kind of plays it lightly, but you're absolutely right. It just cracks open a lot in him.
It's also, this is so interesting the way you set this scene up, because these other two boys, as you said, oh, they're used to this. They're well initiated into what it means to live with the kind of racism of the day and in this town. But Cork has this kind of privilege, right? He's this young boy, he's a son of the sheriff, he's half Ojibwe, but he's half
But he
white.
looks white.
Right. And so we're also seeing him also realize how protected he's been so far from this, yes?
Yeah. And it is the beginning of his understanding of the difficulty that his father has. I mean, now he's beginning to really understand the racial pressures that are part of what his father has to deal with. He really is beginning to get that. So yeah, he's no longer a kid. He understands that people are saying bad things about him and his family. And what does he do about that? You know, what does he do about that? There's nothing he can do about that except learn to live with it.
What I wondered is, in all the novels that chronologically would have followed, but, you know, you've just written this, it's the prequel. If we would be able to go back into this series and find moments that we would be able to connect straight to, that would arc right back to that scene. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm not sure they exist.
Really?
I'm not sure they exist in the way that I think you are hoping they do.
Why?
Because I've always written, with few exceptions, I've always written about Cork in the current day, when he has come to accept that he's not quite white enough for the whites and he's not quite Ojibwe enough for the Ojibwe.
Yeah.
He has embraced that. It's still something that he's constantly aware of, but he doesn't struggle with it the way that he does in Lightning Strike. And so that was, for me, that was where Cork really began to embrace the fact that he's not going to be like anybody else. In fact, I can't remember if it's Sam Wintermoon or Henry Malou who tells him, you will always have a foot in two different places. And it will always be that way for you. And you need to figure out what you're going to do about that.
So there might be, kind of seeds of this in the series. But this is maybe the...
Okay, seeds. I like that, Kerri. Let's say there are seeds.
Okay. I bet you I could find some if I was going back in the series. I want to ask you about something that you said to the New York Times Buy the Book feature. You probably know what I'm going to ask you about. You said...
I know. Go ahead.
I think a case can be made that there's a Midwest voice in literature. It's spare but eloquent and rises significantly out of an understanding of our spiritual relationship with the land here in the heartland. So I want to ask you what the complexities and the sound of the Midwestern voice, and I love the idea of that. But what does it sound like to you?
First of all, it's always good storytelling, because here in the Midwest, we understand that a good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And it has a point.
Okay.
I say spare because, I think about writers like Ted Krueger, beautiful poet from Nebraska, or, although he's not really from the Midwest, he's close enough. One of my favorite writers, a guy named Kent Krueger, who set his work on the eastern plains of Colorado. And his work is just so straightforward and so simple on the surface, and yet the compassion he feels for the people in the small towns of the plains comes through so clearly. And his understanding of why the people are there and what keeps them there, what keeps us in this, tied to this land, is so clear. And I think you see that in Marilyn Robinson.
I was just going to ask you about
Marilyn
her.
Robinson. Her work is just so brilliant and so beautiful, and very lyrical. But I would say it's not prosaic. And I think that's what the Midwest is. We say things very clearly, very plainly, sometimes very simply, but eloquently. Mm-hmm. And the spirituality and the compassion that I think is a part of being Midwest comes through. That's why I live here.
Marilyn Robinson, such a good example of this, because there is, even though, as you say, her characters and her novels, there is plain speaking. Of course, there's many, many dimensions to her novels. But there is no cynicism about some of these, like some of her novels are about what does it mean to forgive? And she comes at that in a way that does not have that kind of, but we all know what I think of as kind of a cynicism to it. It's a true, deep examination.
Thank you. That is something, that is a characteristic that I've been trying to figure out, and it's the lack of cynicism. Mm-hmm. Which I think of as very East Coast, West Coast. But here in the Midwest, we don't have that. Or it's not a characteristic that I think of when I think of Midwesterners.
When I think of the way you've described this, I think of we are okay without the presence of irony, right? I mean, everybody doesn't have to be in on the side joke, right? What do you think?
Yeah.
Why did that make you laugh?
I absolutely agree. For me, give me a story that's told clearly, a story that's told simply, a story that in how it is told gets its point across. The stories, Marilyn Robinson, her stories are very deep.
Yeah.
Kent Krueger, his stories are really deep, but the telling of them is very simple.
Right.
They're very approachable.
That's a masterful thing to pull off, isn't it, for a writer?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That approachability. My father, the high school English teacher, would hate me for that one.
Why?
But yeah, I'm not sure that word really exists.
Yeah.
But I think a story, a good story you ought to be able to read a good story regardless of who you are or what kind of complicated tastes you think you might have. When I write a story, what I want to do is appeal to a very broad demographic. I want precocious 12-year-olds to be able to read my books and enjoy them, as well as their grandparents, and I want to write a story that they can share, that they can talk about, that they can become emotionally invested in, and yet has them thinking about something a little deeper even,
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about the Boundary Waters. So I had my first experience, believe it or not, in the Boundary Waters this fall. I took a group of book lovers, some I knew, some I didn't, up there, and we had an adventurous reading retreat in the Boundary Waters.
In the Boundary Waters.
It was amazing.
Far out.
Kent, it was amazing. I'm going to do it every fall, and if you want to come along, let me know. I think it was kind of beyond my imagination. I used to think I didn't know what I didn't know about the Boundary Waters. And I really would like to understand because you've been there a lot, you write about it. Tell me a little bit about why it is such a sacred place to you.
For just the reason I was talking about the Midwest, with the heartland, and the Boundary Waters is a little outside the heartland, but the spirit of the Boundary Waters is profound. Any of you who have been in the Boundary Waters, you know that. The minute you're in the Boundary Waters, it speaks to you. And it's not just that it speaks to you in terms of the sounds that it gives you, the water and the birds and the wind and the pines and all of that, or the sense that you get of how it comes to you that way. It comes to you in a very spiritual way. And I challenge anybody to go into the Boundary Waters and come out believing there is no God.
Sacred.
Sacred.
Right.
There are sacred places, and the Boundary Waters is certainly one of them,
And
which is why we should protect it.
You have chosen an excerpt towards the end. Maybe you can give us a bit of where we're at in the story before you read it.
Sure, we're pretty much at the end of the story. A lot of things have happened that have changed Cork's perception of the world, his family, and himself. And he's trying to understand if that is a good thing or a bad thing. And of course, he turns to Henry Miller. Sometimes, Cork said, then paused. Yes, Miller said. Sometimes I wish things would never change. That is like trying to stop the dawn, Miller said. Better, I think, to open yourself to what each new day offers. What if it offers only pain, Henry? Cork's father said. In my experience, pain is never the only offering. What we receive depends on what we open our hearts to. We're only human, Henry, Cork's father said. Oh, William O'Connor, we are so much more than that. I haven't seen the spirit of Big John since Moose Lake, Cork said. Did he finally walk the path of souls? I believe his spirit is at rest. And the spirit of Louise LaRose, Cork's mother asked. What does your heart tell you? My heart wants peace for her, Henry, but I don't know. And the spirit of Louise LaRose, of Big John, of you, of me, of every human being, comes out of the heart of the Creator. And when our time in this flesh is over, that spirit returns to the place it came from. Our people call that place Gagige Minawaniko Zinwidig. In your Catholic Church, you call it heaven. What does it matter, the name we give it? His shoulders lifted in a little shrug, as if to confirm that this was of no importance. Every heart wants to find peace. In the end, that is the place the Creator takes us. Cork's father shook his head. Too easy an answer for me, Henry. That does not lessen its truth, Miller replied. Cork tried to listen to his heart, to understand what it was telling him, but it seemed such a jumble of regret, of hope, of fear, of wants, of uncertainty, that it was just noise to him. Malou, as if sensing this, said, "But tonight, around this fire, it is not about trying to understand what awaits us beyond this life. It is about enjoying the gift in this moment together, here under these stars, as the night sings to us. What you are afraid you have lost, Cork O'Connor, is not lost at all. The joy of your friendships, of your family, of moments like this when our spirits touch, this will always be with you. When the journey ahead takes you to the darkest of places, the joy in these memories will be a part of the light that helps you see your way through. This I promise." Even then, Cork thought it was a brave promise. But on that night, in the company of those he loved with all his being, he watched sparks from the fire rising toward the heavens, carrying prayers to the Creator, and he chose to believe it.
Fighting fear with both of my fists, landing right hooks seem so useless. Put down the gloves and pray instead. St. John reminds me that the fear's in your head. Big brother gave me my name, while standing calm in the tempest. St. John on my left, Big Brother on my right. The beast is coming fast, and he's hungry for a fight. Fire falls all around us, with harder times on the horizon. Advancing online, with money signs in their eyes, and my gentle, angry heart raging inside. This is my homeland, and I've sworn to protect it from all enemies, foreign and domestic. My suit of armor made of Copenhagen lids, deflect and protect, 'cause the beast never sleeps. Fire falls all around us, with harder times on the horizon. Advancing online, with money signs in their eyes, and my gentle, angry heart raging inside. St. John and Miquam, they help me to be brave. One lands the right hooks, and the other one prays. Fire falls all around us, with harder times on the horizon. Advancing online, with money signs in their eyes, and my gentle, angry heart raging inside.
Annie Humphreys. Thank you. It's beautiful. Thank you.
That was beautiful.
That was great.
Oh.
Okay, so we have Q&A. So we'll have microphones out in the audience. Just raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Let me say this. You're listening to Talking Volumes at the Fitzgerald Theater with William Kent Krueger. His new novel is titled Lightning Strike. Okay, so questions for Kent. Right there, right over there.
Hey, Kent, Elizabeth from Annandale. Good to see you. I'm wondering about your Aurora is a character. So did you ever set out in any of your books to write the story of Aurora first? Because, I mean, I can describe Aurora, everything about it. I can tell you exactly where Sam's is and all of the streets and the lake facing and the boiler. I mean, all of that. Did you ever set out to write about a community, or was it always character first?
At first, it was just the place Cork lived. I created, for those of you who know the Arrowhead, you know there is a real Aurora, Minnesota out there. And the name for Aurora came about this way. In my initial novel, my debut novel, Iron Lake, the town was not called Aurora at that point. When I sold the manuscript to my publisher, it was called Wendigo. In fact, the novel was called Wendigo at that point, too, because the myth of the Wendigo runs significantly through that first story. But my publisher didn't particularly like the name for a variety of reasons, and so they said, rename your town. Because publishers can do that. And so, I wanted something that for me was evocative of the North Country, and I tried lots of names, but Aurora just stuck with me. The Aurora Borealis. I thought, Aurora, I really love that. So I called up my editor and I said, I want to name my town Aurora, but there's already a real Aurora up there. Can I do that? And he thought for a moment, he said, well, as long as you don't get us sued, you go right ahead. So I called the town Aurora. And I created if you've ever been to the real Aurora, it's not a whole lot like my Aurora. I created my Aurora out of elements of all of the Northwoods towns that I had come to know and love so well. And I wanted to create a town that anybody who knows the North Country, it would feel real to them. But that they couldn't say, oh, it's Ely, or oh, it's Babbitt, or oh, it's Virginia, But I have made references to the past, the history of Aurora, because it was a mining town at one point. It's on the range. But I kind of like the idea of exploring that a little bit more. So we'll see what happens.
Question right down there in the front.
First of all, I'd just like to say my mom and I have enjoyed this series together. And one question we have always wondered is, what was your thought process behind Joe passing away? It's something
thanks
we've
for
always
letting
wanted
the cat
to know.
out of the bag. No, I get this is one question I'm always sure when I do an event. For those of you who might not be at that particular place in the series, in one book in the series, Cork's beloved wife, Jo, does die. And I get a lot of, when that book came out, boy, did I get a lot of angry emails. I don't think I've ever been called a bastard so many times in my life. So here's the story behind Joe's death. When I finished that manuscript, Joe was still alive, because that's what I wanted. And then I read the first draft of that manuscript through completely as a whole piece for the first time to make sure that all of the elements were in place, that the story arc was good, that the beginning worked and the ending worked. But the ending didn't work. And it didn't work because I realized it wasn't the ending the story wanted, it was the ending I wanted. And any good storyteller comes to understand that at some point a story takes on a life of its own. And as a storyteller, you have to be willing to step back and let that story go where it wants to go, regardless of the consequences. So I rewrote this story with the ending as it is now, with Joe dying. And And I wasn't sure where that was going to leave me, or leave Cork, or leave the O'Connors, but it was the right ending for the story. And then I've had a lot of readers write and say, I'm not going to read you anymore, you bastard. But if you read beyond that, what you see is that the journey that Cork and the O'Connors are on beyond that is a journey of healing. And I try to write about things that really happen in the world, and what happens in the world is people we love die. And we don't want them to die, but they do. And the question is, how do we embrace life after that? How do we heal and move on? And was the journey that I had for Cork in the next 2 or 3 novels.
That's such a big decision.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, right? It's gonna alter the path of everything.
Yeah, I had no idea what it was going to do to this series, but it was what I had to do at that point in time. I guess I didn't think of it as like earth-shattering or series-shattering. It was just at that point in time. And then the question for me, like it was for Cork, is, okay, where do you go from here?
Right. Okay, question right.
But I have to point out that the book I wrote after that, a book called Vermilion Drift, was the first of my novels to hit the New York Times bestseller list. I don't know if there's a correlation there. I'm just pointing it out.
Question right down there in front.
I've read the first 10 or 11 novels.
Okay.
Would you recommend, or is it okay, do you think, to read this latest novel before I continue reading in order?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think you absolutely ought to. And I think you should buy it in the very reasonably priced hardcover edition.
I already did.
He says okay.
Just a word about Lightning Strike. One of the fortunate aspects of Lightning Strike is the fact that it is a prequel, that readers don't have to have any knowledge whatsoever of the Cork O'Connor series in order to appreciate the story in Lightning Strike. Often when I get readers, if you're a reader and you're standing before a long-running series, there are like 18 books in this series, that's a little daunting. And you're not quite sure, well, I'm glad that you shake your head. But for a lot of people, it's a little daunting. And I often get the question, where should I start? And my answer is, well, you should start with the first one and then move through. But with Lightning Strike, now I can say, start with Lightning Strike. If you really like my work, then start with the beginning and move through.
Yeah. And by the way, Subtext Books is out in the lobby selling Lightning Strike and a lot of Kent's backlist. So that's really great. I saw some kind of old books. Okay. Way up on the... Left side. All right, up to the left. Up there we go. Wow. Hi
there. From the back row.
All right.
My favorite book is Ordinary Grace. And this might seem like a simple question, but the parts that you wrote where you were giving the eulogy, I just could not imagine how you could do that without being a minister. So I wondered, how did you write those scenes?
Oh, I'm so glad you liked Ordinary Grace. It's such a special book for me. So, the sermon that Nathan Drum delivers after the death was, I knew, going to be a pivotal point in the story. And it's a sermon. And I don't know how many of you go to church, but when you go to church, how long is a sermon? 15 minutes, 20 minutes maybe? I had to write a satisfying sermon in 2 pages. And I worked and reworked and reworked those pages until I thought I had done a pretty good job. And then the book came out. And then I had ministers all over the country, seriously, writing to me asking where I stole it. But here's what I believe. What I believe is that if you are a storyteller, very often in the best of times, what you do is you sink yourself deeper than a place of conscious thought. And I think you touch a universal place. And often what you bring up from that place surprises the hell out of you. There are extraordinary moments, which is one of the reasons those of us who are storytellers are storytellers. And that's the only explanation I have for the sermon that Nathan delivers. It came from a place that was much deeper and more universal than just me.
Question right back there on the main floor.
Yeah, thank you. So when I think about the Midwestern voice, I always think of Willa Cather, and I'm deeply offended that you did not mention her. But when I think about Cather's writing about place, though, it's writing about a sense of people almost trying to come to terms with the place, coming to terms with the plains, and how they are going to almost adapt to the landscape. That's obviously not the case with the Boundary Waters and the North Shore. From your perspective, is there a common voice in terms of place in the Midwest voice when you have people like Willa Cather doing the things she was doing in the last century and what you're doing today?
You know, I love Willa Cather's work, but if you look at her work, it also is a very simple storytelling technique. She's very upfront, very forthright in how she presents her story. My Antonias, it's just a beautiful story of what was then the plains. And there's nothing complex in the structure. There's nothing complicated in the story itself. It's just a wonderful, true story. And it resonates with us because of the truth of it. And I think that's when you look at a storyteller who is admired from the Midwest, it's because they tell the truth of the story, which is also the truth of the land. In the early days, it was the truth of how difficult the land was, Ole Rolvag, or the truth of how much you want to leave the land, but it brings you back, a la The Great Gatsby. And so I think that the voice, that plain-spoken voice, but eloquent, is a part of, you can't separate that from place. If I were really a good teacher, I could probably say that better. I'm trying to think of a way to say it better, and I don't got it.
You know, Kent, it's interesting, though. Willa Cather left the Midwest. I'm sure you sound like you're a scholar of her work or a reader. I mean, early on, basically, in her 20s, late 20s, early 30s or something, and continued, it never left her.
That's right.
I mean, I find that really intriguing.
I'm such a firm believer that once the Midwest sets a hook in your heart, it brings you back. Whether you come back physically or you simply come back because this is the place that inspires you in your work, you come back.
Right. Okay, question right there on the front row.
My favorite book was This Tender Land.
Oh, thank you.
And I read it once, and I was so moved that I had to put it down. And then my book club wanted to read it, so I read it the second time, then I wept. And I have a two-part question. How is it you can put so much humanity into characters in one book that it would affect a person like that? Number two, is it based on any personal experience?
The first question is, I can't answer the first question. I honestly can't answer the first question. It's simply how I tell my stories. And a good story isn't really about what happens. A good story is about who it happens to. And so my first order of business always is to make a reader fall in love with the characters, become emotionally invested in the characters. And then it doesn't matter what the characters do, they'll follow them anywhere. And the second question, what was the second question again?
Was it based on anything?
Based on anything.
Autobiographical?
Yeah, once again, the narrator, Odie O'Banion, is a lot like me. Odie was a Boy Scout. Hey, I was a Boy Scout. Odie is loyal almost to a fault, and that's how I see myself. Odie is resilient, and he's not above a bit of larceny when the situation requires it. And I've been there a few times myself. So in terms of what actually happens, except for canoeing the rivers, which I do, not really. Not much of it came out of my own experience. And this was one of the most delightful experiences I had as a storyteller, simply imagining the whole story. I loved that.
Question way up there in the upper balcony.
I just experienced my first novel of yours through an audiobook, and I'm just wondering how the author feels about that from a commercial perspective, also from a readership point of view, and have you ever narrated any other books?
Well, let's go with the second part of that question. Have I ever narrated any of my novels? I auditioned. I didn't get the job. That's the truth. But I think you saw from my reading that there's a reason they hire professional people to do the a good reader in my estimation is a kind of genius. Imagine having to create unique voices for all of your characters and maintain those voices across the whole course of a work. I couldn't do that, but the folks who do my audiobooks certainly can do that. I don't listen to my audiobooks because they don't read them the way I would. Whenever I try, it's like, wait a minute, that's not where the emphasis should go in that sentence. And how do I feel about them? I don't care how readers come to my work. I just want them to know my stories, come to my stories. And if they listen to them, that's just fine. If they read them on an e-reader, that's just fine. I just want them to know my work.
You listen to audiobooks, as we were talking about.
Oh, I love listening to audiobooks.
I do too.
Yeah, whenever I go on tour, I try to drive as much as I can because I hate flying. And that's how my wife and I pass the time. We listen to great audiobooks.
Mm-hmm. Recommendation of the audiobook you just listened to that I asked you downstairs.
Yeah, we just listened. I lead a book group for my church. I have for about 25 years. And the book we just discussed was a book called The Book Woman of Troublesome Creek. Yeah. And I loved that story. And I thought the reader just did a terrific job.
It'll be out at the library, I'm sure, for months to come. Okay, there was a question, I think, right over here.
So I have so many questions, but what a treat. So first of all, every time I see you or hear you, you have a cap on, and I'm wondering about that. Secondly,
I was wondering about that too,
right?
by the way.
So also, I have not read the Cork series. I've only read it. Touched my heart on a level. I mean, it was beautiful. But for me, a series of one continuing character versus a book like Ordinary Grace feels like such a huge dichotomy. So I'm kind of wondering how you bridge that. And then also, I want to know, you've talked a lot about the character Cork O'Connor, who I don't know. Why is his name so Irish, even though that's his heritage, but you keep kind of bringing the Ojibwe, the Native American piece into it? Cork O'Connor is such like a really kind of fake, bad Irish name.
Wait. No, 3 questions is the limit. All right, the cap. What's with the hat?
The hat, I don't have a lot of hair on my head, and it bothers me. But the reason I usually don't wear a hat when I do an event like this, but I worked construction for 10 years when I was a much younger man, and I never wore any protection. I always worked without a shirt on, had a beautiful tan everywhere. I actually got whistled at once. by a guy. But I'm paying the piper now. I have skin cancer issues, and at the moment, the top of my head is missing about half the scalp because of skin cancer, and so I chose to wear a hat. There you go, perfectly honest, frank answer, there you go. In terms of Ordinary Grace versus the standalone, I had no trouble at all writing a standalone because the story was so compelling to me, and it was so different from the Cork O'Connor series, so different from how I construct a Cork O'Connor story. I had no problem whatsoever. And the same with this Tender Land. I was writing Cork stories between those books, and even while I was at work on those books. And what was the third question?
The name of Cork O'Connor is,
okay. So
she says, cheesy and Irish.
Here's the evolution of Cork O'Connor. Long before I knew what I was going to write, that I was even going to write a story, a novel, for God's sake, I had in mind a character I wanted to write about. And in the beginning, all I knew about this guy was that he was going to be the kind of guy who was so resilient that no matter how far life pushed him down, he would always bob back to the surface, and his name would be Cork. I swear to you, God's truth. I told that to an audience not too long ago, and some wise guy in the audience said, "Why didn't you just call him Bob?"
Yeah.
So when I decided to make Cork a man of mixed heritage, then I had to decide on the mixture of his heritage. If you're up north and you're of mixed heritage, you could be Ojibwe Finn, Ojibwe Swede, Ojibwe Italian, Ojibwe German, Ojibwe Russian, you name it. For a variety of reasons, I like the Ojibwe Irish combination, and Cork became Corcoran O'Connor at that point.
All right, 2 more questions. Let me remind you again, Kent, we're not doing the book signing as usual because of distancing, but he signed a bunch of books. So they're out for sale at the subtext counter out in the lobby. Okay, 2 more questions, one right up there in the top.
I had a question. I enjoy all of your stories. But pretty early on, Cork shed his firearm, and he became more vulnerable, and I liked him better.
Interesting.
I get that too. I appreciated the fact that Cork turned away from gun violence. He made he reassessed his life, and he saw that so much of his life was involved in bloodshed, and he was trying to put that behind him. It didn't work. And I can go into why it didn't work if you would like.
Go ahead. Did he suggest that, or did you?
What was that?
Did he suggest that, or did you?
It was actually the fact that I write murder mysteries that kind of came home to roost. What I realized, and what Cork realized after he made the decision to put away firearms, was that there are, at least in these stories, and in real life, there are people out there who are very dangerous people, and they do, in fact, carry firearms. And Cork finally embraces the fact that he is Ogijida, which is an Ojibwe word that means, well, one meaning is warrior, but my friends in the Ojibwe community tell me that Ogijida really means one who stands between evil and his people. And for Cork to stand against all of the evil that that I write for him, I finally decided Cork needs to carry a firearm again. He doesn't always carry it, but he seems to find a way to get a firearm when he needs one. But I so understand where you're coming from. And when I had Cork put away his firearm, I can't tell you the flood of emails I got from NRA people. Seriously, telling me I'm not going to read you anymore. Yeah. But that's not why I gave Cork a firearm back.
One last question, right over there.
I'm asking for a friend. How long do we have to wait to find out what Cork's son, the way the book ended, his last Cork O'Connor, his son saw visions of dread for another character? How long do we have to wait to find out what happens?
Really good question. Next fall. I have finished the next book in the Cork O'Connor series. It's called Fox Creek, and I resolve the issue, the rather dire circumstances in which I left our beloved Henry Miller.
Thank you all for being here. Please go buy a book. Kent, thank you.
A pleasure,
Thank you.
a pleasure, Kerri.